can't wait for him to get started, so I'm going to introduce Clive.
There we go. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a particular pleasure because one of my old friends, Demetrios, who's a professor and was with me, is sitting there so I can pick on him. I love doing that. You know, one of the number one rules about dealing with schools and universities is to abuse professors. It's just great fun. Now, we're talking about Guantánamo Bay. It's sort of slightly grandiose about lessons. But I did bring the very first case against Gitmo, and it's been a fascinating ride. How many of you are American? I know we've got a couple over here. Who's American? You know, we do have a lot to answer for. I'm American too. But we also learn a lot from it. And what I'm going to do is, if this thing works, is go through a little bit of the history. Because, you know, I'm sure you know that Guantánamo is on the eastern coast of Cuba. I have been there 42 times. It is my Caribbean resort of choice. And it's an intriguing place. And it's, I don't think I'm allowed to swear, but if I was allowed to swear, I'd say something really grotesque about it. And we need to begin in 1991, really. We go back to 1903, I suppose, the Spanish-American War, when we as Americans sided with Cuba to kick the Spanish out, but then we did what we do best, which is we stole a large part of it, and we learned that from the British. And so we made them put in their constitution that we got this base at the end of Cuba, and we have it in perpetuity. And we pay them, it's fabulous, we pay them $3,000 a year for something that's 4 times the size of Manhattan. I don't know how many, I was in New York just last week, and for a tiny apartment in New York where I lived for some years in law school, that's half a month's rent that we pay for the whole of Guantánamo Bay, and we pay it in gold, and the Cubans have refused to accept this derisory amount for some years. And so it went on. It was a coaling station for the US Navy for a long time, as many of our countries steal other parts of the world as our naval bases. We'll talk about a couple that the British stole a bit later on. But when, and look, this is all about hatred, right? We know about populism and hatred, and I've had a bit of a rant in the past about populism and hatred. And Guantánamo Bay in the last 30-some years has been all about how we can accommodate our own hatred of different groups. And it began with the Haitians. And back in the 1990s, we didn't hate all foreigners, did we, Americans? As long as they were white coming, we were fine. The Cubans could come fleeing communism. But we didn't like the Haitians coming. And when the Haitians came fleeing Papa Doc Duvalier and his son, Baby Doc, we didn't want them. George H.W. Bush here came up with this thing which was interdiction on the high seas, and we would send the Coast Guard out to stop the boats before they got to America. Because his lawyers had told him that they had a theory, and it's true of American law. If you're, who's what we refer to as a foreigner here? That means you're a non-American. Come on, Demetrios, put your hand up. You know you are. You're Greek. We've never let your type into America. So people, if we're American, as I travel around the world, I have constitutional rights everywhere. We're really, really nice to you. We let you have constitutional rights if you come to America and you're in America. But if you're outside America, we can do pretty much anything we like to you, and you have no rights. And that's the theory. And so they came up with this notion when the Haitians were coming to America, that if we stopped them before they got there and took them to a place that technically wasn't America, then they had no legal rights and we could treat them as we wished. And do you know how many international UN documents of human rights we as Americans have signed that are enforceable against us, Demetrios? You're a law professor. How many are there? You've got your student next to you. You've got to impress yourself. He says he doesn't know. I just have to repeat it loudly. The answer is none. We've signed not a single one. At one point, we had signed the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. It was the only one that was enforceable against the US, and I used that in a few capital cases. But there are none. So if you have no constitutional rights and no enforceable international law rights, you have no rights at all. And what George H.W. Bush's people argued in Sale versus Haitian Centers Council was that the people that we took to Guantánamo is not technically the US. They have no rights. And astoundingly, and this is one of the many silly things the Supreme Court's done over the last many years, they agreed with him 8-1, and they said the Haitians have no rights at all in Guantánamo Bay. That allowed us then to send them all back to Haiti, which in my view is despicable, but there we have it. There's a reason why I've been tried for contempt of court 5 times. I've been acquitted each time, it should be said. Anyway, so that worked for him, but actually that whole business ended after a few years. And time went by, and then we had another group of people. And, I say this. There's a reason, and you can understand why the US got so intensely upset after 9/11, right? Who remembers where they were on 9/11? I sure do. I was doing a capital case in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and I was going out in the morning to find witnesses, and I couldn't find anyone. The whole place was a ghost town. And I went back to the place I was staying and saw the pictures of the first plane flying into the tower. And extraordinary. And you have to accept that we as Americans have actually not been invaded as much as you Europeans. There's only been 3 times in history that our territorial integrity has actually been breached. 9/11, December the 7th, 1941, which is Pearl Harbor, and the other one? 1812, when we burnt the White House. The White House used to be gray. And I say we when the English part of me. And it used to be gray until we burnt it, and then they made it white. So those are the only 3 times. And so America responded. It was a most extraordinary and terrible thing, 9/11, but it was all the worse for the US as having not been on the receiving end of that sort of thing like the Russians have so often. And so the response was Guantánamo, and it was because George Bush there was reminded by Donald Rumsfeld, who was actually the Secretary of Defense for him and his pa, that they could use Guantánamo Bay to try to avoid these people having rights. And one of the rules of extremist right-wing people is that they want to do everything in secret, and we'll look at Guantánamo through that lens. Because some of the things that go on, it was in the paper just today, that you just want to stop people from publicizing it. And much as our dear president right now says he's in favor of free speech, it's not really true, is it? I mean, he's in favor of some people's free speech. So they chose Guantánamo in order to be secretive. And it was really interesting. I love thinking about this, about why they do things. And when we first heard about Guantánamo, I started looking for other places around the world where they might take prisoners, and we had a whole thing on it. It's fascinating. And I've got to say, one of my favorites was Diego Garcia, and it's for this reason. You look at all the American bases around the world, and there's almost 200 of them, and you look at where they might use to hold people secretly, and you think, well, what are they doing in Guantánamo? Diego Garcia, what's so fascinating about that, and I know the British said no one was held there, but then somehow all the records got salt water in them and got destroyed. Can't imagine how that happened. The reason you knew it was happening in Diego Garcia, and we went after them there, was because there are 12 places in the world where the country has not asserted its 12-mile territorial limit in the sea. And those 12 places, they all have a reason. The one you would think of most obviously is in the Straits of Japan, where they only assert a 3-mile limit because that way the American ships can go through it, and the Japanese couldn't have nuclear weapons on their territory. So that's why they had that limitation. Diego Garcia was one of the other 12 places, and if you put your ship right in the middle of that space, it's far enough away from land that technically the law doesn't apply because it's in the sea. So you knew that's what the Americans were doing. And that's why we chased them there. And all of these things, you're trying to, one of the lessons from Guantánamo is you've always got to think what the other side's up to. And you've got to think sensibly about it. You can't just say, oh, man, I hate them. You've got to think, what would I do if I was a fascist? Sorry, if I was Secretary of Defense for the United States. Anyway, so then one of the other early issues about Guantánamo was when we were looking at it, we were thinking, what are they doing this for? And it was all about secrecy. And the mantra that we had representing prisoners in Guantánamo was they're only doing this in secret because the thing that Bush had to do was he had to look like he was doing something meaningful about terrorism, right? And, invaded Afghanistan, that wasn't achieving a whole lot. And he had to be tough on people. So they put these guys in Guantánamo. Donald Rumsfeld said they're the worst of the worst terrorists in the world. And, as long as that was all secret, he might get away with it. My colleague, there were three of us, brought the first case against Guantánamo, and one of them with me was Joe Margulis, who's an old death penalty friend of mine. And Joe said they wanted to be secret. It's going to be embarrassing. It's always embarrassing when you expose what the government's doing. If we open it up, they will close it down. That was Joe's mantra, and it was brilliant. It was really what guided us all the way through. And that meant that it was all about the court of public opinion. It was all about getting in there and getting the facts out and publishing them to the world. This chap, I've had 87 clients in Gitmo, and this is Haroon. He's a lovely guy. He was the last Afghan, the second last Afghan in Gitmo. One of two people who we got out of 765 where the court ordered his release. All the others got out through the court of public opinion. And an incredibly important rule in all this stuff is court of public opinion is way more important than the court of law. Who's a lawyer here? You are. Put your hand up. There was a fascinating study in California that the MMPI, have you ever done the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, a psychological test? The three groups of people in America who come out as sociopaths, doctors, lawyers, and mass murderers, which puts us in our place, right? But I do think that our profession is less important than some others, and the court of public opinion is very important. Another incredibly important thing, when we began Guantánamo, the American Bar Association, the ABA, said, you mustn't take part in it. It's unethical, it's all wrong, their whole system is dreadful. And, I've got to say it's just wrong. If you boycott, you get one story. Our job is not to boycott, it's to get in there and tear it down. If it's an unfair system, our job is to tear it down. You have in Britain a way worse system than we have in Guantánamo. Your special advocate system is horrific. And in your special advocate system, if someone's charged with terrorism and they have secret evidence, they get to talk to their special advocate once. Then their special advocate, who almost invariably went to Radley, where I went to school, goes into court and is never allowed to talk to the client again. That's madness. In America, we're trusted. I have a security clearance. I see the secret evidence. If I tell you what I see, I'm going to have to kill you. I'm sorry. But we're trusted not to do it, and I obey their rule because you have to. But nevertheless, we're allowed to see all their secret stuff. And our job is legitimately to get it out. And I'll tell you how we do it. The first time I talked to someone was Mazen Beg. He was my first client in Gitmo. He told me all the stuff about being tortured. He told me about a taxi driver being murdered in front of him in Bagram. And I had to write that out in my notes. It was all classified. I had to send it to Washington, go to Washington, type it up. And I submitted it to them, and they said it was all secret. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. They say, well, this is national security. And I say, how can this be national security? And they said, well, it's the methods and means of interrogation. And I said, look, can't mean that murdering this guy Dilawar was the method and means of interrogation, and the CIA guy smirks and says it is. It's just total madness, right? So we had to figure out how to get around that. And the way we got around it, I was sitting there with Joe Margulis. We were the only two people doing it at the time, and we were quite frustrated, but then we had this idea, which was I wrote a letter to Tony Blair. And obviously I said, "Dear Tony," like I'm on best friends terms. And at the top I put, "In re torture of British citizens in Guantánamo Bay." And then I detailed some of the torture. The last sentence was, "Anything they've redacted out of this, they don't want the British people to know, love, Clive." And so they redacted everything except the first line and the last line. We published that on the front page of the Times. And your imaginations are far worse than anything the CIA can come up with. So it caused a massive scandal. The White House called over there and said, "You can't do this stuff." And that's how we started getting all of the torture stuff out. And that's what, you got to be there. You got to be there to do it. One of the other fascinating things about Gitmo is we control the entire story. Because if there's one rule out there, it's the CIA is never going to say anything, except sometimes they'll fib. But they won't respond. And to begin with, when we sued them, we were agonizing in Washington. We hadn't met any of the clients at that point, and we couldn't. They were held incommunicado, and we had to use a family member to represent them in court. And we were agonizing over whether we could say that all the prisoners we represented were, number one, innocent, and number two, had been tortured. And, I know where I came down on that. You can probably guess. But, it's perfectly legitimate to say they're innocent because they're presumed innocent until they're proven guilty. Whether we could say they'd all been tortured, this was February the 19th, 2002. There wasn't much out there, but there were already rumors coming out about what was going on. So we alleged all that. Now, at that point, it's over to the government to prove that we're not telling it as it is. And the thing about this when you're dealing with secrecy is they can't. Because the moment they say, well, actually, we're not torturing everyone, we get disclosure, we get discovery, and they have to turn all their stuff over to us. So we proceeded on all of this with the presumption that everyone was innocent and tortured. And honestly, I didn't believe that back then. But, extraordinarily enough, we have proven 98.48% of the prisoners to have been innocent. We'll get to that later, but it's just extraordinary. Where in the history of humanity have you ever had anything quite that bad? Now, the next rule is if it's going to be bad, let's make it really bad. Now, put your hand up if you've ever been waterboarded. I have. I'm going to tell you, how many people send their children to private school? Put your hand up. I'm just going to tell you about something that you're paying for. When I went to Radley, I was waterboarded. I'd forgotten all about this. But what they used to do at Radley, but as sociopaths, is they'd put you in a bath as part of their hazing process, and they'd put wooden slats over the top, fill it up with cold water till you were drowning. And then, as a special little coup de grace, if you poked your nose out to try and breathe, they'd take a pin and stick it in your nose. And I'd forgotten all about that. But when I was talking to one of my clients in Guantánamo, he starts talking about waterboarding. I've been there, done that. So don't send your kid to a private school in England, all right? One of the rules when you're dealing with something that's bad is you want it to be really bad. Because, people shy away from this, but actually, if you're going to prevail on this stuff, you want as much bad stuff as possible. And sometimes, my clients would look at me like I was a total lunatic, because they'd be telling me these dreadful things, and I'd be happily writing it all down. And that's a rule. Another rule is that if you're in there, you're going to find out all sorts of stuff, because it's extraordinary what the government does. I mean, I don't have to tell you. You let Keir Starmer loose for a couple of weeks and just watch. But in Guantánamo, it was just extraordinary. When I first got there, and I was one of the first people who got in, they had a souvenir place. They've still got it. They've still got a souvenir shop in Guantánamo Bay. And the one I liked most was, we obviously don't torture, do we, because we're American. So we didn't do that. We called the people doing this abuse behavior modification instructors. Can you imagine? And in the souvenir shop, they had T-shirts that said, behavior modification instructor. And obviously I bought a dozen of those. But the thing that really got me was they had onesies for little babies that said future behavior modification instructor. They were expensive. They were like $25. But I wish I'd bought them all because I gave the one I bought away, and I wish I had 10 to show you today because they were so fabulous. And so we really embarrassed them by taking pictures of all that stuff and spreading it all over the world. It was absolutely fabulous. And here we are in 2025, and if you go to the souvenir shop in Guantánamo, they've got rid of those ones, but they still have all these amazing other ones. This young lady is wearing "It Don't Gitmo Better Than This" T-shirts and Gitmo Island Paradise stuff. And there's a lot of people who are too rich and have got everything, right? But I can buy them T-shirts from Guantánamo that they don't have. There's a great place for my Christmas gift shopping. That's what they do to themselves. But your job, when you're doing this, you must never, ever stop. This is another rule. Never, never just let them do it all. If you're going to illustrate the madness of all this, you've got to provoke them. And, honestly, it's fun. I used to go there for 3 weeks at a time. And, it's not a wild nightlife in Guantánamo Bay, to be honest. Although I do enjoy going there. It's the best part of the job because I get to spend time with the clients. But on your off time, you get to think about ways to illustrate the madness around you. I love going there with new people who have never been there before so I can see it through their new eyes. But one of the things that we learned quite quickly was I would take books in for my clients to read, and then we'd see which ones got through. And there was a real... Who was it who wrote the English? I think I got this wrong when I was last thinking about it. It's one of those BBC presenters wrote a book called The English. That got in, which is a great insult to you as an author. If they let it pass the censors, it meant it was a shit book. I'm proud to say all of the books I've ever written got censored. But then we played this game about what could we get censored, and, it's no surprise, we got Jack and the Beanstalk censored. And, each of those things was such a fabulous story. Do they believe there's a magic bean that's going to help my clients escape from Guantánamo? And I've known John Grisham for many years. He's a wonderful, wonderful supporter of the sort of work we do. And, he comes from northern Mississippi. Shall I tell you a story about John? I was having lunch with him one time, and he told me this thing about how he only ever tried one criminal case, and he was young and didn't know anything, and he was convinced his client was innocent. So in his closing argument to the jury, he said, "I am sure my client's innocent, but I know I'm shit. I promise you, if you acquit him, I'll never try another case again." And they did, and he didn't. And I thought that was pretty funny. But I've read all of John's books. He's a great raconteur. And he wrote this book called The Innocent Man. It's about a guy on death row who was exonerated. And so I got him to sign a copy to Shakarama that we submitted. And, of course, that got censored because it's got the word innocent on the front page. Can't have that in Guantánamo. So they censored it. And then John got to write an op-ed in the New York Times about how these people are all deranged. And these things, so the rule is you got to push them. You must never sit back. If you're going to do your job, you've got to provoke them into their own madness. The next rule is the power of celebrity. I've got to say, over the years, I've met so many famous people, and it's always such a joy to meet some famous person who's really delightful and modest and nice. And, I'm going to name some of them just in case this is being recorded again and they hear about it, because it's nice to be able to say that. David Tennant, adore the guy. Olivia Colman, fabulous. And I was talking, this is me dropping names fabulously quickly, right? I was talking to Colin Firth one time, and, he was saying, I'm really embarrassed to use my celebrity for these things. No, Colin, it's powerful. And I went to the thing is very humbling, actually, for those of us who are not celebrities, because I went to Pakistan one time with Jemima Khan on drones. And, Jemima, our great ally in Pakistan's Imran, of course. And so Jemima and I went there, and we did a press conference, and we said basically the same thing. And my office, just to make me feel bad, run my name through whatever little program they have. And I was quoted by 2.78% of the Pakistan media. Jemima was quoted by 78% of the Pakistan media because they all love her. And to be sure, some of the headlines was, is Jemima getting back with Imran? But the stories were about drones, and the stories were about injustice. And these people are fabulous. What is, someone put your hand, okay, I'm going to pick on you again, Demetrius, and I'm going to repeat it. What's the longest you've ever gone without eating any food?
2 hours.
2 hours, yeah. I used to say about 20 minutes. But, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Hunger strikes. The prisoners in Guantánamo would go on hunger strike against the injustice they were facing. And the problem is, if you go on hunger strike and no one knows about it, it's the tree falling in the forest, right? Did the tree ever exist? And so our job was to promote that as much as possible and do other things. When Shaka was on hunger strike, he couldn't deal with it. So we got a bunch of celebrities to take over the hunger strike. And I did it a couple of times for a week, and it was actually really interesting. It's quite easy. And the British, when Bobby Sands was doing it back when he was doing it for the IRA, the British let him go on hunger strike. He was elected to Parliament, and then he died. And to be honest, he probably did an awful lot for the cause he wanted to support by dying, right? Now, the Istanbul Protocol says that if someone competently goes on hunger strike, you're not allowed to force feed them if they're doing it for a political purpose. But obviously, there's not any law that we haven't broken in Guantánamo, so we force-fed them. Now, we didn't really force-feed them because we called it enteral feeding, so no one knew what we were talking about. And our job as lawyers was to tell the world about that. And the best way to tell the world, who knows who that guy is? Do you know who he is? Oh, dear. That's Yassine Bey, a.k.a. Most Def, the rap star. And he was in London, and so he was very kindly agreed to be force-fed up at the Guardian headquarters up near King's Cross. And we put him through it and filmed it, and dear old Yassine wept like a child after the thing got in there. And it was fabulous. And when we filmed him doing it, I had it done to me too, but no one cares about that. They probably enjoy it. When I waterboarded George Galloway, everyone thought that was a great thing, and probably the same with me. But with him, when we force-fed him and put it on TV, on YouTube, 10 million people watched it in the first couple of days. And this is incredibly important in everything we do. We have to get famous people. I'm about to do another thing. I'm desperate to get a celebrity to do what I want to do. It's a different story. Now, then another thing is exposing what they're doing, because they're always trying to hide it, right? And you've got to figure out how they're trying to hide it. And I had this wonderful, wonderful client in Guantánamo Bay, which is one of the great ironies. It was Sami El-Haj. And Sami, you don't need to take pictures. I'll send you the PowerPoint if you really want this stuff. Sami El-Haj was a Al Jazeera journalist, and the US abducted him in Afghanistan, where he was minding his own business as a journalist, because they thought he was another Sami who had interviewed bin Laden, but they had the wrong Sami. And by the time he got to Gitmo, a bunch of snitches had made up a bunch of stories about him, and he was there for 6 years. And Sami and I love Sami. I was really sorry to get him out, because he was my best client, because no journalist was allowed to talk to a prisoner, right? No, they'd all come there and they'd have the propaganda tour where they could see all these things, but they couldn't talk to anyone. And they actually couldn't take any of the bizarre rules about which pictures they could take. But Sami from Al Jazeera, who, let's face it, George Bush threatened to bomb Al Jazeera in Doha. And when I first went there, they wouldn't talk to me because they really thought that I was going to bring some cruise missile down on them. But they got to be great. And Sammy ended up I talked to the people in Doha, and they ended up putting everything Sammy told me that I got through the censors in front of 40 million people on Al Jazeera, which was fabulous. One of the things he told me all about, and by the way, Sammy is a good friend of mine. He's the godfather of my son. I am the godless father of his son. He told me all these things. There are no juveniles in Guantanamo Bay, the Americans said. And Sammy gave me a list of 54 juveniles, defined as people who were under 18 at the time they allegedly did something. And so these military people would come out and say, there are no juveniles in Guantanamo Bay. And for a while, you'd just think, what are they saying? And then Sammy got for me their definition of juvenile. And what they did, they just redefined the term. So in order that they could lie to you, they said that now a juvenile, instead of being what the US Supreme Court says it is, which is under 18 when they did something, it has to be under 16 now. So even though we took people who were 12 years old to Guantanamo, if we held them there for 4 years, they were no longer juveniles, apparently. And this is how they got to lie about that. The one that I loved was they would say there's no solitary confinement in Guantanamo. Lots of evidence that solitary confinement is itself torture. And everyone in Guantanamo was in solitary confinement. I couldn't think, how are these people saying that? And instead, it turned out they had a new term, which is called an SCO. And who here knows what an SCO is? None of you. But there's all this acronym bullshit they make up. SCO is a single-cell occupancy, and that's what they called it. So they could look you in the eye and say, we don't have solitary confinement, we have SCO. This is the worst one. Nobody commits suicide. Well, I know for a fact 4 people have committed suicide in Gitmo. And the reason they said that was they said, no, it's actually an MSIB. And when we translated that through Sammy, that means manipulative, self-injurious behavior. You know, these were extraordinary. And of course, each of those was an incredibly powerful story that delegitimized what the US military was doing to my clients. And that's another important lesson. But you've always got to remember this. When we think about Trump being mad and Nigel Farage being deranged and Tommy Robinson, or actually his real name is Laxley, whatever it is, we can't just spend our whole time complaining about people, right? It's totally unpersuasive. For us to just say, oh, I really disagree with these people, doesn't get you anywhere. We have to do positive things. And one of the things we had to do in Guantanamo, and this is a rule in all the advocacy you'll ever do, is you've got to present the positive. You've got to present the positive alternative. And it was actually great to do that, to do human stuff. One of the things that the prisoners, the detainees, turned out to be so good at was painting. There are an amazing number of great artists in Guantanamo. And so we had to get art supplies into them, which was quite a thing. And, you know, that one is a picture by Ahmed Rabbani. I really like it. I think it's very impressive. But I had him do, the ones that were really great was I asked him to do pictures of all this torture. And he brings them to a meeting with me one time in Guantanamo, and they were fabulous. And when people say a picture paints 1,000 words, boy, they do. But you knew the CIA wasn't going to let those ones get out. So what we did instead was I wrote an incredibly detailed description of each picture, and the censors, who are sometimes bears of little brain, let that out. And then we got artists on the outside to replicate them. But we also got all the really good art out, and then people in America got to see art shows by our clients, and that had a really real impact about seeing people as human beings and not just as terrorist suspects. And when Ahmed got out, we did an art show for him in Karachi, which was fabulous. And one thing we have to do for all of these guys is help them get back on their feet, because sad to say, you know, it's not top of the American list to say, I'm sorry, I really screwed you over and you're innocent, here's $1 million. They never get anything. So when they get out, we really have to help on that. Now, then there is the use of language generally. I know pride is a deadly sin, but I'm very proud of this. There was, when we're thinking about language, everything is about what people hear and who you're talking to. And every jury trial you ever try, you got to know how the jurors think. And you mustn't speak Greek to a Roman. It just doesn't do any good. But you've also got to think about how they're going to hear it. If I tell you that my clients were hung up by their wrists on their tiptoes, how bad does that sound to you? What do you reckon? You does? Why? I mean, compared to putting you on the rack or waterboarding you, or she thinks it sounds bad. I just want to say for the people listening, who thinks it really sounds as bad as waterboarding? Who thinks it doesn't sound as bad as waterboarding? You have to say something or I come and torture you. All right. You see, this is the thing. Some of these things don't seem so bad. So I had a little project which was to look up what we called not torture, but EIT, an enhanced interrogation technique. And I wanted to see what the Spanish Inquisition called it. And stripado is what they called that back. And the really bad one is the sort of reverse stripado like that. It's incredibly painful, apparently. I haven't practiced that on myself, but gradually your shoulders dislocate, and it's excruciating. And one of the proudest moments in my life was I've been calling it stripado, and the New York Times started calling it stripado. And the thing is, they had to say, the US military is using stripado, parentheses, this is the name given to it by the Spanish Inquisition. And, that changed some of the dynamic. The one that really did was this. Waterboarding, which we said was not torture as an EIT. So the Spanish Inquisition called it tortura de agua, which obviously means water torture. We called it enhanced interrogation. I don't speak German, but I'm reliably told that what the Gestapo called it, verschärfte Vernehmung, means enhanced interrogation. And I just love that, because that means that we are using enhanced interrogation the same as the Gestapo did. And that made it very hard for the military to think that they were doing a good thing. The use of language is just incredibly important in all this. Then there's how they had the T-shirt, it don't get no better than this. Actually, the key to all of this was to get out the stories that showed just how bad it was. Now, you're going to squirm a little bit, but this is Binyam Mohammed, and Binyam's a British guy who I represented, and when I first saw him, he told me his story. And he said, just like all these guys, you have to wonder, are people going to believe these folk are innocent, right? I mean, how many people think, honestly, most people who end up in prison, they probably did something, right? You agree with that. Most people believe that. And we got to figure out how that happens, how innocent people do get caught up. And one picture I don't have here is actually the picture of the bounties that we paid for people. I've got these bounty flyers, which are fabulous, which have a picture of a Muslim guy here, a pile of dollar bills here, and the same Muslim guy behind bars. And we were paying between $5,000 and $20 million to the Pakistanis to turn people in. And, lest you don't believe it, turn to page 234 of In the Line of Fire, the dreadful autobiography of Pervez Musharraf, and he boasts about it. And he boasts that more than half of Guantánamo are there because the Americans paid bounties to military officers who are corrupt. So here it is. Look to the person on your right. I know that's your mother. Everyone has to look to the person on their right, except you have to look to the person on your left. I'm offering you $20 million to snitch on him. I know you don't care about him. $20 million. All you have to do is say, he was in Tora Bora in October 2001. The odds are he can prove he was at Gresham or someplace. So you're going to get $20 million. You could cut a deal with him and give him $2 million, and you keep the 18. Are you going to do it? Yeah, damn right, you see. I mean, this is what happened. This is why so many innocent people ended up in Guantanamo. There's a twist on it of someone I'm representing right now, that with women, They also showed picture books to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who they were waterboarding, and they wanted him to tell stories about the people, tell what he knew about the people in the picture book. He chose the woman I'm representing because he thought that no one's going to believe she's the leader of Al-Qaeda because we didn't have any women. We're a chauvinist organization. So he made up a story about her. And that's what ended up having her children abducted and her abducted, and she faced 5 years of torture, and she's still in prison in America. So these are the things that happened, right? Now with Binyam's story is such a parable for Guantánamo. He's a British guy. He was sold to the CIA in Pakistan. The CIA starts interrogating him, and Binyam, because he grew up here, he says, I know my rights, I'm not talking to you. I'll talk to the British because I'm British, but I'm not talking to you. And they said, you don't have any rights. But because he's really, I love Binyam, but he's the most obstinate person on the planet, and he wouldn't talk to him. So the more he didn't talk to him, the more they thought he must have something to hide. And so they tortured him. They took him to Morocco, and in Morocco, they took a razor blade to his genitals every 2 weeks for a year and a half. Now, how do you feel about that? I mean, when I heard this from him for the first time on 3 days I spent sitting with him in Guantánamo, and he told me all this stuff. And at one point he said, Clive, you're going to have to fill in the emotion because I'm just a bit dead in the head. And I'm sitting there listening to this stuff and writing it down. And I got to say, I came out of there with PTSD, let alone him. It was just horrifying that anyone would do that. And I went to Morocco on this, and I talked to their foreign minister, and he was very nice. And he said, we're trying to move along, but there's just some people here who do that stuff. And anyway, so when he was being tortured, who's a physicist here? Put your hand up. Who did physics O-level or GCSE? You did GCSE. I'm going to give you a little test here. Do you know how to build a nuclear bomb? I just can't. Did they not teach you anything? He said no, he doesn't know how to build a nuclear bomb. Surely you know that. Well, I took S-level physics. You take some uranium, 235 and 238. Well, and how do you split it? I think 239. But how do you split it?
You use something that turns around very fast.
You use a centrifuge. And he said something very fast, just for those who can't hear. And I believe that the Iranians are accused of spending a lot of time and money trying to get the right sort of centrifuges from this Pakistani chap. And I don't know why they wasted their time, but Binyam, when he was being tortured, finally says, well, I did read something about how to build a nuclear bomb once. And he said, it said you put your uranium in a bucket, you swing it around your head for 45 minutes, that divides your uranium up into your fissile material, and Bob's your uncle, you got your nuclear weapon, right? From your experience in O-level physics, does that sound realistic to you?
I have no idea.
Yes, you do. It's total bullshit. And, and why would the Iranians spend so much time doing this if you could just do that? And it's sort of reminiscent of the 45-minute nuclear weapon that was going to hit Britain from Iraq. So anyway, he said that. And of course, because everyone was terrified about weapons of mass destruction, understandably so, this got back to Washington. And instead of people saying, as half the CIA must have said, this is just silly, they got in a big panic. John Ashcroft interrupted his time in Moscow to say, we have just solved a nuclear bomb plot headed for 42nd Street in Times Square by this guy, Benjamin Mohammed. And that was the source of the nuclear bomb plot. And, this is really important because if I torture Demetrios, as I'm often inclined to do, and I get him to say he's a terrorist, it's too bad for him. He gets stuck in Guantánamo for ages. But if I torture him into saying there's a nuclear plot, or as happened to Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, they took electric cattle prods and tortured him into saying that Saddam Hussein was in league with Al-Qaeda on WMD, that was what Colin Powell said in the UN as a reason to invade Iraq. Some of this torture evidence has such massive consequences, and Binyam's did too. And when he told me that, I've got to say I taught my son how to build a nuclear bomb, because he asked me one time, and God knows what GCHQ made of my Google searches, but when Binyam told me about how to do that, as a joke, right? So as soon as I was legitimately allowed to, I Googled it. And there was indeed an article from 1972, which was a spoof about how to build a nuclear bomb that said just that. And I tried to track down the woman who wrote it, but she was in a retirement home by then. But I found her daughter, and she was working for the LA Times, and she wrote this fabulous article, How My Mum Was Behind the Nuclear Bomb Plot. And, this is what the sort of thing we got out of torturing people in Gitmo. And Binyam, they were seeking the death penalty against him. And what was fabulous about his case, he was such a great sense of humor. And we had these battles in the military commission. And the prosecutors were real, they were real prosecutors, and they wanted to kill him, and they kind of wanted to kill me. And then gradually we exposed all this stuff, and they came from death to life. They offered 20 years, and finally they came to me and said, if Binyam pleads guilty to now, we'll let him serve one more day at Gitmo and send him home. And I said, if you're going to do that, you're going to send him home anyhow. And the two prosecutors, to their great credit, and I've met a lot of great military people in Guantánamo who genuinely believe in the US Constitution, they both quit their jobs. And one was Colonel Mo Davis, one was Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Vanderveld. They quit their jobs and went on the circuit saying, this is madness, this is not what the US Constitution is all about. And that's fabulous, and that's another incredibly important principle, which is I'm not a great messenger. I am, as we all know, a commie pinko liberal. A DA once told me he'd buy me a one-way ticket to Russia, because that's what he thought I believed in. And, these people who are military officers are so much more powerful as advocates, and we have to get them on our side. This is what we got out of Guantánamo 2.0. There have been 780 detainees, 765 are no longer there, 3 are cleared for release. For us to get anyone out, we have to convince 6 American intelligence agencies that they're no threat to anyone. So Donald Rumsfeld said they're the worst of the worst in the world. We've proven that 98.48% of the people in Guantánamo are no threat to anyone. That's really something. I challenge you to come up with a single practice in human history where we've got it so wrong so often. It's extraordinary. And I was flying to Gitmo one time on British Airways, and I was talking to the nice person who was the steward, and I said, would you fly on British Airways if your plane came to the wrong airport 98% of the time, or maybe crashed 98% of the time? And she said, no. It's a truly extraordinary thing, and the lesson from that is whatever you thought when they first opened Guantánamo, whatever I thought I was going to have to prove some serious stuff when I went down there, and we did. We had to prove it, but we did. And we proved that this was extraordinary. And when you look at what Trump's doing now, let's talk about Gitmo 3.0. When you look at what he's doing with immigrants, it's the same thing. When you look at what he's doing bombing those boats that he says are drug dealers coming from Venezuela, they're using the same intelligence. When Obama became president, he said, we closed Guantánamo, we stopped torture, and instead he started using drones. And that was when I was doing the litigation on drones. And they killed 5,000 innocent people with drones. And again, it's just, you find out what's happening. And I found out, I did a thing with Imran, a jirga we called it, because it sounded grand, where we invited all the people from Waziristan to come to Islamabad. And I learned there what was really going on. There was this young kid called Tariq, who I was talking to, and he came because his uncle had been killed in a drone, and he wanted to know what to do about it. And I said to the crowd, I just made this up, but you know it's true. 2 people in this audience are working with the CIA, and everyone starts looking at each other. And I said, this is what they're going to do. They're never going to snitch on someone who's really dangerous, because that's dangerous. They're going to snitch on one of you lot, because that's easy. And you know how we'll know what they said? We'll know what they said by the press release that comes out the next day. And you know, I said that. I didn't really know it was true, but it made logical sense to me. Tariq was killed 2 days later after he was at that thing. And we knew it was Tariq driving a car, age 16, with his 14-year-old cousin. And the press release said, 4 militants. So you know what the snitch did was he attached a tag to the car, and they droned it, and then they did that. And they did that all the time. And if they do that in Guantánamo, where they've got months and years to interrogate and find out about you, they're going to do it in all the other things. They really are. Extraordinary thing of my last few years is to work out how incredibly bad their intelligence is. Now, Trump, this is what happened in Gitmo 3.0, January 21st, 2025. I just got my last of 87 prisoners out of Guantánamo. I'm still working on some of the others, but these were the ones I actually represented directly. And Trump comes in and says he's going to put 35,000 new people there. I thought, great, you know, this can keep me busy for the next few years. And so he started on February the 4th. Look, that was only a couple of weeks. You've got to give him credit. They took the first plane load to Guantánamo. 16 days later, they took them all out again. And, you know, this illustrates, again, how wrong they get it sometimes. What he forgot, or his lawyers forgot, was the lesson, which is we can only screw you foreigners over if you're not in the US. If you're in the US, you have all the legal rights I have. And so they had brought all these people from America, and they came with their rights. So I got to say, it was I was looking forward to doing this, but I didn't have time because there were these really good immigration lawyers who piled in and made their life miserable. So they emptied Guantánamo as quickly as they filled it up, which was great. But of course, he's now doing it in El Salvador, and that's our next challenge. Now, I've gone on longer than I meant to, but this is the real rule of Guantánamo Bay. There's always people who are going to be doing their hatred, and the price of liberty is not just eternal vigilance, it's about what we do. I hope your mother, I'm pointing at her because she made me get her a free ticket, and her mum's next to her. Her mum was a public defender in the US. I hope your mum has told you what my mum told me. And if not, she's about to lean over and tell you that your job for the next 50 years as a privileged person is to look around the world for the people who are most hated and to get between them and the ones doing the hatred. And that's all of our job at some level, and that's the job that we had in Guantánamo. They were phenomenally hated. You know the big beneficiaries of Guantánamo were my African-American death row clients, because the Americans forgot to hate them for a bit, because they hated the bearded Muslim people. But it's always our job, and this is what we have to do. So I hope with that, I can leave you with this, and that's it. There. No, we haven't finished yet.